Hey guys, back again with another video. For real this time. Going to the Palace Grounds of Versailles. There's the statue of Louis XIV behind me. Riding his horse. So a bit of historical background. For those of you who don't know, Versailles was, for the better part of its existence, not the capital of France. Royal presence here was first really established in the second half of the 16th and first half of the 17th century. When Henry IV of France established a hunting lodge around in this area. It was all heavily wooded in those days, and there was a small village. Henry had come to the throne in a series of pretty vicious civil wars over whether Catholic or Protestant would control England, and Henry had converted to Catholicism to please his largely Catholic subjects. Henry is murdered in, I think it was 1613. But the hunting lodge stays. But the royal center of power is still Paris. And it remains that way until the reign of Henry's grandson, Louis XIV, the Sun King. Sorry about that, had to go through security. It remained that way until the reign of Henry IV's little grandson, Louis XIV. Louis XIV's early years, for all his might in being known as the Sun King, the early years of Louis's reign were just completely hamstrung by trouble. The 30 Years' War was going rather badly for the French, even though they won a pretty significant at Rocroi 5 days into his reign. They're still not yet on the winning side. When he was in his teens, he had to deal with a massive uprising of the feudal nobles led by his own uncle, my ancestor Gaston, Duc d'Orléans. And so Louis, and there were also various uprisings in Paris. So as soon as he gets the chance, beginning in the mid-1670s, Louis gets out of here. He gets out of Paris. He never forgives the Parisians for their revolts. And he moves the center of royal power here, to the Chateau of Versailles, which during most of his reign was still being heavily renovated, just like it is today. Here, take a look. Yeah, so I'm going to cut it right here. So, yeah, I mean, here's part of the grounds anyways. Thing that you can't really get here, but you can get from being like right over there, past the pond, is just how big this place is. I mean, you can see everywhere, but like if you go where I pointed earlier, you have perfect line of sight on pretty much everything in the palace grounds. Alright, so towards the end of his life, Louis is just engaging in so many profligate wars and losing so many profligate wars and spending a lot of money on these things. And he's also spent a great deal of money on the palace behind me. But again, you can't really get a sense of how big this place is unless you're right here. I mean, that has to extend for like miles. Because it's not just that lake we're talking about. We're talking about like hundreds of acres, like a couple hundred acres worth of forests, and a few private estates, etc. So Louis, as you might have seen, as you might know, has basically completely upgraded this place from the hunting lodge that his grandfather had erected in the 16th and early 17th centuries. By the beginning of the 18th century, this palace is going to be as complete as it ever will be. It's decked out. The palace itself, the grounds, we have yet to get to those. Also, for my reenacting or living historian friends out there, you just walk through here. Actually, you walk through a lot of parts of France when there's like pebbles all over the place. A lot of it's actually flint. So, if you ever really want to just pick up a ton of flint for free, ready to go soft and nap it and everything else, just go to Versailles in the morning, go to France in general, or go to a quarry. Alright, so for those of you who really do not wish to be walking all day through this palace grounds, and believe me, it's just a maze. If you come into the grounds from the left side of the palace, go a ways up, there are two green buildings, I want to say about 100 yards from the gate. What I'm zooming in on now, you can pick up some golf carts and drive off after renting one of those. There's no reservation process though, so you're just gonna have to wait your turn. Alright, checking out. Alright, so right now I'm standing in the Bosquet de Dauphin, or the Dauphin's Grove. The Dauphin being the simply until the middle part of the 19th, after the first quarter of the 19th century, the term for the French crown prince. And this would appear to be his place where he would hang out for hunting or just for walking through. Forests, plenty of statues, good stuff. Okay, so Louis XIV dies in, I believe, 1713. He's been on the throne for almost 70 years. In fact, a little bit over by that point. And he had just left, or no, 1715, I'm sorry. In that range from 1713 to 1715. He had left behind a country that was just a mess financially. His great grandson, Louis XV, is not up to the task in any way at all. Spends a lot of his reign simply bankrupting the country by engaging in more expensive wars. Manages to lose the entirety of present-day Canada. Yields what becomes Louisiana territory to the Spanish. His reign is just one unqualified disaster. So he dies in 1774. 4 years previous, his grandson, the Dauphin, Louis, had become heir apparent after his own father, Louis's eldest son, died. Eldest, I believe, only son died. So Louis the Dauphin becomes Louis the 16th in 1774 at the staggeringly young age of 19. No one has prepared him for kingship. No one has prepared his wife, Marie Antoinette of Austria, to become queen. It really just is the worst possible time for France. They're already massively in debt. They're no longer the preeminent military power in Europe. They're certainly not an economic power anymore. And so Louis has grown up sort of in the Enlightenment circles and tries to do some things to restore France's shattered economy. I'm going to cut it here because I have to get through security. So, where was I? As I was saying, Louis attempts to restore France's economy by abolishing certain taxes and abolishing certain privileges for the nobility. The problem is, he's completely spineless. The nobility vetoes all of his or attempts to veto all of his efforts at reform. And if he had said enough is enough and actually stood up for himself and what he believed was right, he probably could have put through those reforms. Problem is, he really lacked much of a backbone. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was also not terribly popular. For 4 years, she had failed to have a kid, which is disastrous as far as the French nobility was concerned, and the French people. The Queen's principal duty was to provide an heir to the throne. 1778, she has her first child, a daughter, so automatically invalidated from inheriting the throne of France. And but then several years later has another child, Louis, who becomes the Dauphin. So the situation seems all good, except that it isn't. Louis attempts to deregulate the grain market, much like you would attempt to do today. Problem is, we're not operating in the 20th or even the 21st or even 20th century. We're operating in the 18th, when agriculture is not like all the snuff and, is not agricultural tools and so forth, are honestly pretty primitive to what we have today. There's no pesticides and so forth. And so when Louis deregulates the market at the advice of, very liberal politicians and ministers, mostly, as I said, again, from the nobility, the price of flour just goes through the roof, and bad harvests just aggravate that situation. So Louis is simply not, he is not cut out for the role. Indeed, when his grandfather dies, there's that famous quip, unsure if it's true or not. He says, "Protect us, Lord, for we reign far too young." And Marie Antoinette probably shared the same sentiments. She was only 18 at the time. As I mentioned, no one had prepared them at all for governing one of the preeminent powers in Europe. Not second rate yet. We'll get to that. But Louis attempts to institute some financial reforms. However, in 1788, 1789, France's harvests reach an all new low. The finances of the realm are just collapsing as a result of his backing the American rebels in their revolution against Britain. America's not trading with the French as they were expected to do. They're still mostly trading with the mother country of Great Britain. Not quite yet the United Kingdom. So with America having effectively bankrupted France, the banks have forced Louis to hire a Swiss banker, Swiss financier named Jacques Necker, who begins to institute some much-needed reforms by forcing Louis to summon the Estates General. And Louis actually has to enlarge the Estates General slightly to gratify the will of the people. The estates basically operate, though. They don't operate as a one-man, one-vote. They operate in blocks. The nobility and clergy, who made up 2 of the estates, are only 2 or 3% of the population, not more. But they had the most political influence of any people in the realm. And the 3rd estate's everyone else, from the poorest peasant to the richest merchant. Louis' other option basically was to default. So the Estates General are summoned. 1789, they begin to institute a series of sweeping reforms financially. Louis is not too keen on this, even though he likes to view himself as an enlightened monarch. he simply backs the people who he's grown up with. So after that, Louis starts bringing in troops from the provinces, from foreign provinces, more specifically areas that don't speak French. Germans, Irishmen, Swiss, Flemish, Bretons, and Italians as well. So Louis makes himself very unpopular with that move, terrified that the king will send troops in to crush the Estates General and the peasantry, or the Third Estate. The people of Paris rise up, storm Les Invalides, which is the military hospital and arms storage for Paris, and they sack the Bastille, killing its governor and most of its garrison. So Louis has now run out of options, and he's forced to yield to the will of the National Assembly, or the Estates General, newly christened National Assembly. Eventually, things are not going terrific, though. By the time October 1789 comes around, the king, even though he's agreed to most of the demands, has been kind of dragging his feet. Paris is starving, and the women of Paris take to the streets. They take the initiative and begin an all-night march on Versailles. They threaten to kill the queen. Louis is out hunting in the palace grounds when he hears about this, and he immediately rides back to the palace. For all his faults, he genuinely did love his wife. And, sorry, there's this group of school kids passing us. Yeah, sorry about that. So, yeah, Louis genuinely loves his wife. He comes back to Versailles. He's a little late to the party, though. Very late to the party. In fact, the French peasants have already started to break into the palace, kill a number of the guards, and force Louis essentially to prostrate himself before them. Louis and the extended royal family at that point are forced to, by the Third Estates, to shift the royal center of palace out of Versailles and back to the city of Paris, where it hadn't been for over a century by this point. And it's pretty safe to say that by the time the royal family arrives in Paris, the French monarchy, as Louis XIV, Philip the Fair, or Charlemagne would have recognized it, no longer exists. It's just, the absolute monarchy is now on its last legs. And that's where I'll cut it for now. Within 4 years of the summoning of the Estates General and the subsequent establishment of the National Assembly, Louis is dead, his wife is dead, his children, the Dauphin, is dead. The second Dauphin will live for a couple more years, his second son. But it's fair to say that the French royal family was pretty much wiped out. Indeed, by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, the direct line of the House of Bourbon is just gone. There's only two branches left today, and that's the Bourbons of Spain, which are descended from another one of Louis XIV's grandchildren, and the Orleanists, one of whom had voted for Louis XVI to be decapitated before he in turn met his own demise at the hands of the guillotine. or below the blade of the guillotine, I should say. The French Revolution is nonstop for nearly a decade. For over a decade, I should say. Then, in October or November of 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte returns from Egypt. He had been on a military campaign there. And he had returned from that expedition to seize power in France. And when he did so, he established himself as first consul, later as emperor. He set up his headquarters. Where do you think? The seat of the old regime, Versailles. But not, crucially, not in the great palace that we saw earlier in the day. He sets his headquarters up in the country estate, outside the walls of the main palace, and outside the prying eyes of the French peasantry. So, another reason why Marie Antoinette was probably so unpopular is she constructed what can only be called like a Potemkin village, or like a pretend peasant village. There's some more of it over there. It's under construction. I'm sure you can tell. And she would go here with her ladies in waiting and her courtiers and some other friends, and play at being a peasant. And, well, the real peasants were starving, and this didn't exactly endear her to the average person in France. Coupled with her lack of ability to get a male child, really didn't help at all. Not even with not just her popularity, but the popularity of the Bourbons in general.